Welcome to Merchman Seeds Cup of Joe. On this episode, Area Sales Manager Brett Ward and Phil Needham from Needham Ag Technologies join us. Phil specializes in intensive wheat management for maximum yields. He gives insight on his research and experience in all aspects of wheat production.
Hi, this is Joe Mershman. Welcome to Merchman Seeds Cup of Joe. Today we have Ben, Lynn, and Turk, and two special guests. I'll turn it over to Ben to introduce them.
That's right. Today we have two awesome guests. One of those guests is Brett Ward. He's a sales manager in Southern Illinois on the eastern half, and then Southern Indiana. And with him, we also have Phil Needham. So Phil, why don't you start us off? You have a very unique background. Talk to us a little bit about what you do and how you got to where we're at today.
Sure. I sure appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. So I guess in the summer, I believe it was, of 1989, I got a call in the middle of the night by Billy Joe Miles. And anytime you get a call in the middle of the night, it's never good. But he'd forgotten about the time difference when he called, and he wanted me to come see him. And I just thought it was a dream. So I woke up the next morning thinking, what in the world was that? About a week later, an air ticket arrived in the mail, and I came over to meet him and started working for him in the late, I believe, November of 1989. And I worked for him as part of the wheat management group. And we expanded. We started out in Kentucky, went south to Tennessee, went north to Indiana, Illinois, and then more in the late 90s, early 2000s, we spread out west into Oklahoma, Kansas, then up into Nebraska, then South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, and then we hopped across the border and went into Manitoba and Saskatchewan, all with wheat management services. So I worked for the Miles Farm Supply Organization in those areas. Then we actually spread out into Australia, New Zealand, and some other countries. So I worked for them until 2006, when I had the opportunity to start our own company, Needham Ag Technologies. And basically, I do a lot of the same things with wheat management, still working with a lot of the same growers, still working with a lot of different growers around the country and different countries. So that's a little background on what I do, okay?
Well, you may find this ironic, but my dad knew Billy Joe Miles from Owensboro, Kentucky, and they were friends. And we went down there probably in 90 or 91, maybe 92, to find out what you guys were doing to raise 100 bushel wheat back then, or even higher. And we spent a day with Billy Joe Miles, and he went over all the management things that obviously you taught him to raise high yield wheats, because at that time we were probably getting 50 bushel wheat, and you were getting almost double what we were. Billy Joe Miles was definitely somebody way out front in wheat production and in many other areas too.
He had a lot of vision, and it all began, I believe, in 1985 when he worked. Back then it was ICI before they became Novartis and Syngenta and everybody else. But I believe in 1985 he went to England and met Dr. Derek Hall, who was a top guy in wheat production working for ICI at that time. And he toured Billy Joe around some really good producers. And ironically, one of the farmers that they went to see, I was working on at the time. And that kind of established some very early communications between those two people. But Billy Joe was able to see 125 to 175 bushel wheat in the mid 80s. And I think his farm average at the time was 50, and the state average back then in the mid 80s would have been mid to high 30s. And the Kentucky state average today is high 80s, low 90s. So, there's a lot of things that have gone on in the past 30 to 40 years with wheat management for sure.
Philip, what was the state average when you came here?
35 to 40.
35.
And now it's high 80s, low 90s.
Philip probably won't take credit for that, but his program is the reason the Kentucky average jumped up.
And it wasn't just me. We work with a lot of good people. And one of the biggest, I'm going to call it accelerators, was Billy Joe was president of the Board of Regents at the University of Kentucky. So he had a lot of control and say-so over the University of Kentucky, in addition to extension. So he was able to initiate some things in extension that really sped up, the University of Kentucky involvement. So that was a big plus. He was instrumental starting their wheat science group, for example. So that was a big leg up for wheat management too.
So where are you originally from, Phil?
So I'm originally from England. I grew up and was educated in England, and I get to England 2 or 3 times a year. In fact, the last time I was there was summer of 2023, and the current wheat yield holder, ironically, lives about 3 or 4 miles from where I grew up in England, and he broke the world record in 2022 with a yield of 267 point something bushels per acre. So I was able to go see him last summer and learn a little bit from what he did to get that kind of yield on a field. That's not a 2-acre plot or a 3-acre plot. By Guinness verification protocol, the yield is averaged on a field. So 267 point something was his yield, okay?
That's very, very impressive.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So I guess let's start at, let's do a little bit of recap on what you guys have seen this past year on planting conditions and things like that. And what does the wheat look like currently for you and your customers in the Mid-South right now?
So most of the wheat was planted into good conditions. And when I say good, most of it was planted timely. Now, we don't want to plant wheat too early for 2 reasons. Number one, it tends to be a magnet for aphids and the vector virus, barley yellow dwarf, which manifests itself early to mid-spring normally. So we don't get carried away planting wheat super early, but we want to plant it timely. And last fall, the drier weather conditions, very limited rainfall, allowed most people to get the wheat in the ground in a timely fashion. Most growers had moisture. So as long as they could get the seed in the ground, covered up into moisture, most of it came up pretty uniformly. So from a stand count perspective, we take stand counts in the fall, ideally taking 10, 12, 15 stand counts in a field. The numbers were close to the ideal range and pretty consistent. So we had a good fall for establishing wheat as long as it was planted in a timely fashion. But timely is an important statement when we're talking about high yields. We want to plant it timely to be able to generate the right amount of tillers per plant, to get close to the right amount of heads per square yard at harvest time. All of these are important considerations for high yields, okay?
So what is that time frame, and what is the population that you see as most successful?
So I'm in northwest Kentucky, so we normally plant here from about the 10th to the 25th of October, ideally. It's rare we want to plant before the 10th. Again, freeze damage increases proportionately if you plant earlier than that. And freeze damage may only raise its head 1 year in 3, 4, or 5. It's about an average of 1 in 4 or 5. So if we plant much earlier than that, especially with an early maturity variety, freeze damage can be a big problem. So that's one reason we don't plant early, in addition to the barley yellow dwarf component I mentioned a little while ago. So northwest Kentucky, 10th to 25th of October is the target window. If we go north, 100 miles, 200 miles, we're going to bring that planting date a little earlier, maybe the 1st to 15th, 1st to 20th, something in that range. You also ask about population. So a lot of our wheat here gets no-tilled into corn stalks just because most growers have the highest amount of net profit planting wheat into corn stalks and then following up with double crop beans. We're obviously far enough south here to be able to double crop beans. So that's the biggest profit rotation for growers is corn, wheat, double crop beans. So a lot of our wheat here is planted into corn stalks, no-till. And that's been very successful. And most of the wheat in Kentucky is no-tilled, and the vast majority of it is no-tilled into corn stalks. So if we're no-tilling into corn stalks on the 10th of October, 15th of October, for an example, we're dropping 375 or 400 seeds per square yard. That's the way we quantify it. If you want to convert that to seeds per acre, just multiply it by 4840. Now, we prefer to plant into soybeans if possible. And the further you go north, obviously, the less double cropping there is. And there's more opportunity to plant wheat into soybeans. It's a little nicer set of conditions to plant into. And if you're no-tilling into soybean, you can bring the seeds per square yard down by maybe 50. Now, if you're in a tillage environment, which some guys are, if they've got the labor to do so, you can bring it down maybe a little bit more. So I'm going to say 375 to 400 is generally where we seed in no-till conditions, planted, timely on the early end of the planting date range. But if you're planting later, we up the seeding rate by about 10% a week. Or if you're planting into nice mellow work soils, you can bring it back to maybe 300 to 325 seeds per square yard. Again, that would be on the early end of the planting date window, okay?
How deep do you like to plant wheat?
Most of the research that we've done over many years would suggest 1 to 1.5 inches is the ideal range. If you plant it deeper than about 1.5 inches, it limits tillering, so you have to bump the seed rate up a little bit, and it takes longer to come up. So if you're planting later into cooler soils, and the soils are often cooler at depth, then it delays it coming up. So 1 to 1.5 inches is our ideal range, and we'd like to see them all at 1 inch or all at 1.5 inches, depending on moisture and availability of moisture. But 1 to 1.5 is the ideal range for most producers. If you're planting no-till into corn stalks, you're going to have to be on the deeper side to try and get as many seeds in the ground covered with soil as possible.
So, Phil, can you explain the correlation between planting too early and freeze damage?
So, again, let me start out by saying freeze damage in Kentucky is about a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 event. And there's a lot of different components, but what it is early maturity varieties break dormancy earlier in the spring and take off earlier in the spring. And in the years when we see spring freeze injury, it's nearly always the early planted fields that were planted in an early maturity variety. And then maybe in early March, mid-March, you might see some 80-degree days or something like that. And if guys have already got the nitrogen on it and then they get warm temperatures, then it grows off real quick. And sometimes it joints in them years, and then you may see a night down to 23, 22, 20 degrees for more than about 2 hours, and it actually gets cold enough to freeze that developing head within the jointed stems of those plants. So that can have a dramatic negative impact on wheat yields because it basically takes out all of the highest yielding potential stems or tillers. So to avert that, when we plant on the early end, and again, I'm talking about the ideal window, but we always try and plant full season varieties early and then plant the early varieties later. And that doesn't sound like much of a difference, 3 to 5 days difference in breaking dormancy and taking off growing early in the very spring. But many years when we have a spring freeze injury, that's the difference between a field making 100 or more or making 50 or 60. I mean, I'm talking 40 or 50 bushel difference just as a result of planting the right maturity at the early end of the planting date range. Because within those similar years, later planted fields see little to no freeze injuries. So it's really important to start with the fuller season varieties when you're planting early and then plant the early ones later in a spring freeze damage year.
Very good.
Question about if you're a livestock producer and you want to graze wheat and you want to plant it early to get more pasture, how do you feel about all that?
So I've spent quite a bit of time working with growers in Oklahoma. That's where, and the panhandle of Texas primarily. And a lot of those growers will plant mid-September, 20th of September, to get enough growth, and then they graze their cattle on the wheat fields, and they'll keep it in there, depending on the year and the cattle prices. They'll keep it in there, and they can have some pretty good wheat yields. It definitely has an impact on wheat yields, and as long as they don't leave the cattle on there too long in the spring and just munch it off level by the ground, they can still have some pretty good wheat yields. So I mean, I'm not against the practice. I understand the benefits of trying to get some cattle on the same field as the wheat. You're not going to get top yields, but there's still a pretty good profit margin associated with that practice in those areas, okay?
Is it soft red winter wheat also there?
Kansas and Oklahoma and the Panhandle of Texas, that would all be hard wheat. Almost all of it would be hard wheat. Yeah.
Perfect. Good question, Turk. So that gets us into where we are now and where we're moving forward. What are the next big steps that guys should be thinking about? And I guess when it comes to a green up time frame, what are some of the things that guys from a standard grower practice are kind of missing out on that you feel that here in the next couple months guys should be really thinking about from a high yield perspective with their wheat?
So from many, many years worth of research, we know with good confidence that maximum yields of wheat come from a head count of most varieties around the 600 heads per square yard range. So if you plant early and you fertilize it too heavy, too early, you've already got too many tillers. If you put nitrogen on really early in the spring, especially at a full single shot application, you can often end up with 5-6 tillers per plant. And if you've got 250 plants established and each one has 6 tillers, let's say, you're well on the way to 1,200, 1,500 heads per square yard at harvest. And then you've got lodging problems. You've got a lot of interplant competition. It gets taller. But the biggest challenge is you've got too many stems for that plant to sustain from a high yield perspective. So trying to control the head population is massively important. It's one of the most important things that we've done since we started working with wheat growers. So we do that with timing nitrogen. So if a grower plants wheat early and he's got lots of growth in that field, the worst thing we need to do is put nitrogen on early, especially at a high rate. So if he's got plenty of tillers or too many, all he needs is just a little bit of nitrogen at green up to maintain the plant health. Do not put a full shot of nitrogen on fields that have a lot of tillers, is what I've maintained for many years. Now, the reverse is also true. For whatever reason, if the farm help was limited, if the guy couldn't get the wheat planted and it's late and it's small and it's thin, that's a situation where you can go in and put a heavy shot of nitrogen early, and you're not going to compromise standability at all because it's already thin. In those situations, you're going to struggle to get the wheat, thick enough to get maximum yields as it is. So you can push the nitrogen rates early on the smaller, less tilled fields. But nitrogen timing is absolutely the key to trying to establish the head count in the right range.
With that nitrogen application, what is your thoughts on having sulfur, and where do you think the sulfur needs on a lot of these growers? It's something that's a growing practice in corn and soybeans as we travel north. What's your thoughts on like ammonium thiosulfate, or where do we need to be on poundage for sulfur?
So I'm going to take you back just a few years. So it wasn't very many years ago, when I was still at Miles's, in fact, just about every replicated wheat research study that we did in Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Missouri rarely showed an economic response to sulfur. And the only exceptions were often Sikeston, Missouri, when it was grown on 3 CEC sandy soils, which is an environment obviously more suited for sulfur applications. But more recently, since the power plants are being cleaned up or switching to gas, natural gas, or diesel fuels, getting all the sulfur taken out, we're starting to see more responses to sulfur. So if a farmer hasn't had a history of sulfur at all, then we'd certainly recommend putting some sulfur on. It kind of depends on the rotation and if that farmer's had any history of manure or sulfur applications, but we're big proponents of sulfur if the farmer hasn't had a history of sulfur, especially on some rolling ground that may have some really low organic matter hills. That's generally where we see sulfur deficiencies first. The only other exception would be, heavy residue no-till systems. It seems like some of that sulfur's tied up in some of that residue on the top of the ground that hasn't been broken down and returned back to the organic matter form. So that would be some situations where we do recommend sulfur. We do recommend liquid nitrogen just because farmers can apply it evenly and accurately with a sprayer and use the same tracks through the field to apply their herbicides. And you can certainly put some sulfur in with that liquid nitrogen also.
Very, very good. Another one of the questions I guess that I had that it happens a lot more up here, and it's much more common practice in the north, and with a lot of our customers to the north, is having the weed and feed program at that green up timing. And I know that's kind of a big no-no in the south, is keeping the harmony out of the 32. And what can you kind of explain just a little bit on why that mix is hot, and what we can see from a yield loss standpoint when we try to put our weed killers in with our nitrogen at that green up time frame?
Sure. So when we first came to this country, it was actually quite common to add a herbicide with the nitrogen and spray the two together, and it just burnt the wheat, and immediately we saw that wasn't good. But if you're burning wheat leaves as bad as what most people were doing or still are doing in very limited examples, we recognized there was a yield reduction associated with it. So over many years of replicated research, again, Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Illinois, Missouri, we've done replicated studies in those areas many, many times. And I'm going to say anybody that mixes Harmony or any herbicide with liquid nitrogen and sprays it over their wheat is going to see somewhere in the order of an 8 or a 10% yield reduction on their wheat. So we don't want to do that, okay? And there's two reasons that we don't want to do that in addition to the yield loss. Number one, if growers are waiting to control their weeds till March or April when it's warm enough to use those herbicides, they've probably already had a yield loss from the weeds. What I mean is we try and spray all of the winter annuals in the fall before they compete with the crop. Now, in the 8 to 10% yield reduction examples I gave you, those were in weed-free replicated trials. So weeds were taken out of the equation. But I'm going to say there's an additional yield reduction if farmers wait till spring to control their weeds. If they're bad enough, they've probably already had a yield reduction by waiting till spring to control it. Now, if you've got garlic, that's an exception. But I think most times when people are spraying weeds in the spring, they're trying to knock out the chickweed, the henbit, the common winter annuals, and they absolutely need to be controlled in the fall. You can either use Sharpen with some residual, along with the burn down when you burn down the weeds ahead of emergence. We can come back over the top with some residual herbicides in the fall, again, to knock out the weeds and keep the fields clean in the spring. That's another really important step, okay?
I've come to realize that, but that's a fairly common practice up here with a lot of the guys. They treat wheat like poverty grass, and they don't want to have two different applications over the top, and we've really been pushing guys to go that direction. I know you're also a pretty big proponent of not using flood nozzles when you're applying your liquid nitrogen. You're a big proponent of stream bars. Do you have any data that you'd like to share with us on stream bar application of nitrogen versus floods, or even stream bar nozzles themselves? Or you know what I'm talking about, not the stream bars, but the like the 7-hole or the 3-hole nozzle.
I'm going to say, and I'm going from memory, and I've got that data. I can get it for you and get you we've got a lot of data on that over many years. And again, these are multiple locations over multiple replicated trials. But if you graph it out or show it on a bar chart, the lowest yielding wheat is always wheat sprayed with flat fan nozzles with a herbicide. That's always the lowest yielding set of treatments. The next lowest would be when nitrogen is applied to wheat with flat fan nozzles or flood tip nozzles. That would be the next worst. And both of those visibly look bad soon after you make those applications because the leaves are damaged and it just looks bad. But the lowest yielding treatments would be those two. The next lowest treatment would be a 3-hole nozzle. And then the next lowest treatment would be the 5 or the 7-hole nozzles. And at the top of the list is always, with no exceptions, always the stream bars. The Schaefer stream bars like these deliver nitrogen vertically straight down into the canopy without hardly any leaf injury at all, as long as it's not windy. Now, if it's windy, some of the large droplets get broken down into fines and can cause a little bit of leaf injury, but it's still very, very minor compared to a flat fan or a flood tip. So if you got your own sprayer, the screen bars are definitely the way to apply liquid nitrogen evenly, accurately, straight down with minimal injury, just because you've got these large droplets that dribble off the leaves rather than getting leaf retention with the flat fans or the flood tips. But
is that a 20-inch bar?
Yeah, that's a bar for 20-inch spacing. You can also get them for 15-inch spacing. But these generally give anywhere from 5 to 7 bushels per acre increased yields compared to the 3-hole or the 5-hole or the 7-hole nozzles. And again, that's much better than spraying nitrogen over the top, and that's much better than mixing it with a herbicide. So everything's relative, but wheat likes nitrogen uniformly applied, and the stream bars are a good way of doing that, okay?
Sure. These will snap right on your T-jet spray couplers. Do you still put an orifice in them to control the amount of flow going through?
This is actually what we call a multi-rate bar. So it has built-in orifices which enable you to deliver different rates. And roughly speaking, at 10 miles an hour, this multi-rate bar will put on about 10 gallons in setting 1, 20 gallons in setting 2, 30 in 3, 40 in 4, 50 in 5, 60 in 6. So
did you say what pressure?
That's at about 30 psi roughly. So that's a multi-rate bar. You just have to have one bar, and it enables you to deliver different rates for different timings of different applications. For example, if the wheat's small, a grower may want to put on 20 gallons. If it's large, you may only want to put on 10 gallons. So it gives the grower the ability to change the rates. You still got to punch in the rate into the monitor, but you still need the orifice to be able to regulate the flow regulate the pressure going into the bar to maintain a minimum pressure.
I always felt like it looked like 4 pencil leads shooting straight down at the ground, just a solid stream with no pressure, no busted up fines to create burn.
And the good thing is they're not height dependent. A lot of your nozzles, such as the 3-hole nozzles or the 5-hole nozzles, are incredibly height sensitive. So as the boom goes up and down on rolling ground, you get these parallel streaks running the length of the field. So it's a good way of putting nitrogen on, because you don't get much leaf burn unless it's windy. And again, if it's windy, it's minimal compared to a flat fan nozzle.
A lot of really good information there, and some things that guys can think about. Beyond that, how I guess we got our nitrogen covered, we got our weeds covered in the fall for super high yielding wheat. Next step would be Palisade. What are your thoughts on Palisade? How often is it used? And your guys' general geography, what's the timing on it? What rates do you like? How dependent is on the weather and things that have happened up to that point?
Sure, and that's almost a presentation in itself. let me start out by just giving you a little background. So Palisade or other growth regulators that are available worldwide, and we don't have some of the better ones in America. We do in Canada, but they've not been registered in the US, which is ironic. But Palisade is one of the growth regulators that we can use. And I don't think there's ever any research that suggests Palisade increases yields. Now, what it does do, depending on the variety, it will shorten most varieties by 4 to 6 inches at the full rate, okay? And because you shorten the plant, it helps the plant stand up. So indirectly, the growth regulators will help yields if you're in a high lodging pressure environment. So if a grower plants early, and again, I'm not a huge fan of planting early because of freeze damage and barley yellow dwarf that we talked about, but if that grower's got a lot of residual nitrogen from a failed corn crop or manure that was applied within 2 or 3 years or more before planting the wheat, immediately that field becomes a high lodging risk. And if he plants a taller variety, I really like planting short varieties. If a variety is 30, 32, 34 inches tall, that's what I try to recommend, because they stand up so well compared to a 38 or a 40 or a 42 inch variety. The shorter varieties rarely need Palisade. So if you've got a taller variety that's planted earlier, that's in that high lodging risk category, after manure or nitrogen left over from a previous corn crop or a history of alfalfa. There's almost endless examples. That's where Palisade fits. It really needs to go on at the jointing stage. If the lodging pressure is high, we're going to go at the full rate of Palisade. But again, I don't use a lot of Palisade just because we try and find shorter varieties that, again, 30, 32, 34 inches tall. That's going to be the same height as a 40-inch variety with Palisade. You see what I'm saying? So most varieties don't have endless funds to spend on their wheat. And if we talk about spending $13 or $15 an acre on Palisade, I'd much rather start with a shorter variety that doesn't need the Palisade, and then we can put that $12 or $15 an acre towards, a good fungicide program later on that's likely to make a lot bigger impact positively on their bottom line.
Well, that's a good segue into from a timing standpoint. What is your opinion on fungicide? Is it a flag leaf plus heading? Which one is the most important, or what's your program look like?
So it depends a little bit on the variety and the year. Most years we will go at least a flag leaf fungicide, and that will generally be a combination of a triazole and a strobilurin at first flag leaf fully extended. So that's going to protect that flag leaf all the way until flowering stage, when we go in there with Prosaro Pro or Miravis Ace. Miravis Ace is a little bit better, gives us a little bit better plant health and plant greening. It keeps the plant a little bit green, a little bit longer, so it may be a little tougher to thrash. So keep that in mind. But Miravis Ace is what we use the most, just because it's got a little bit better disease control package, and it keeps that plant greener and healthier longer. So we're pretty much on most every grower that we work with, 2 spring fungicides, one at flag leaf, first flag leaf fully visible and extended, and then we're coming back at flowering stage with the Miravis or Prosaro Pro, and that application is really important to protect that crop from fusarium, okay?
Yeah. Have you seen that there's been a bunch of improvement with the wheat varieties on head scab in the past? And I guess you have any comments on fusarium head scab?
So fusarium head scab would be similar in frequency to freeze damage. It's generally different years, but generally in Kentucky and the Ohio Valley region in general, it's about a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 year event. So farmers sometimes get complacent. They didn't have any head scab last year. Well, we're not going to spray for it this year, but it turns out it's a fusarium year and they get hammered. So we can't risk not applying a fusarium head blight fungicide on wheat. But we're not just targeting fusarium head blight. We're after all of the foliar diseases, the leaf rust, the stripe rust, the sectorias. We're after all of the diseases, but it's so important to keep that plant clean and healthy as long as possible. We're not just getting fusarium. So that's another reason that we use 2 fungicides. Again, one at flag leaf first visible, the second one at flowering for fusarium control, in addition to extended foliar disease control.
Couldn't agree more. I guess, well, one thing that we did kind of jump over is we talked about splitting that nitrogen timing. When is your second nitrogen timing that you find to be the most effective? We manage based on tiller count and seedling count on the green up on how much nitrogen we would apply. But when is the most effective second shot of nitrogen in your opinion?
So almost all of the second application, and everybody we work with would split the nitrogen, and there's many advantages to that. But the second application nearly always goes on between first node and second node. So it's going to be somewhere between 12 to 14 inches tall, maybe up to 16 inches tall. That's about the ideal time. If you look at nitrogen demand for a wheat crop, until jointing stage, I think that wheat crop has taken up about 45% of the nitrogen. So the majority of the uptake occurs after jointing, and there's some pretty high demands within that time period, especially if it's warm and it's growing actively. Uptake is generally 4 or 5 pounds per day of nitrogen. So if it's warm and moist and growing very well, you have to have the second shot on ahead of that stem elongation stage And again, it would be time between first and second node. And that's the stage in which you have to go in there and put the nitrogen on evenly, accurately. You don't want to damage the leaves. So that's the timing for the second shot. You don't want the wheat to yellow up. So if you only went in with 10 gallons early, that crop's going to run out a little bit earlier. That would be an example where we'd go in there at first joint. If you put 20 gallons on, which is 60 pounds of nitrogen in 28% form, and it's still green, then we're going to go in there at second node with the second one. But first to second node most years is the timing for the second application of nitrogen in the spring.
Great. What other questions do we have while we have the expert here?
Phil, last year you work with a lot of farmers. What type of yields are they getting with your program?
So I'm going to start on the high end. One of my growers last harvest time, and last harvest was a challenge because it rained about every other day. But one of my growers broke the Kentucky state wheat yield record. It was 143.7 bushels per acre on a 5-acre plot. But I think that 75-acre farm averaged over 125 bushels per acre. So I'm going to say in a good year, and last year was a pretty good year because it was a little cooler. We had 2 or 3 more days of grain fill. We were close to 35 days of grain fill last year in our wheat in northwest Kentucky. Some years it's 32, 33. And that extra 2 days of grain fill often adds 3, 5, 7 bushels per acre. So that was an advantage for us last year, together with good sunlight. So I'm going to say the better yields or the better years, we got fields 120 plus. Now, on average, I had a lot of growers last year on whole farms, 2,000, 3,000 acres. They were a little bit over 100. So and there was quite a few guys in Kentucky last year that was over 100. Again, the state wheat yield, I've not seen the final data. The preliminary data from USDA for 2023 harvest is about 90. So if the average is 90, there's some guys out there making 70 and there's guys out there making 110. So I'm going to say well-managed wheat in a good year is somewhere between 100 and 120 on average.
Very good.
Tissue testing for micronutrients in the plant. If we tissue test now, would you recommend dry, liquid?
On micros?
Micros, specifically boron and zinc.
And that's a good question. So I did mention in passing, we did some replicated research at Sikeston, Missouri on sandy soils, Near East Prairie, actually. Just low CEC soils. So for those of you out there that are farming on low CEC soils, especially when coupled to no-till, especially after corn stalks, that's a really, really hungry environment. So in those environments, they're probably going to need sulfur. That's not a micro, but they're going to need sulfur. They're probably going to need some zinc. They're probably going to need some boron. So in those instances, another good thing about liquid nitrogen, you can pour into the tank a quart of zinc and a quart of boron, making sure it's a good product with a good composition. You don't need something that's got 0.1% boron. You need something that's got 10, 20, up to 40% boron, and we're using a quart of those products. So I would go in there and I'd probably split it. I'd put some in with the first application of nitrogen. And if you're in those low CEC, hungry soil environments, I'd probably put some more in with a second shot. We've seen some replicated research also suggesting that when we put that second fungicide on, or even the first fungicide, as long as you select the right product, we often see some responses to foliar zinc flat fan applied with the fungicide also. So that would be a quick recap on strategies for some of the micros.
Okay. Will we get any leaf burning with the foliar applied zinc?
That's why I'm just telling guys be careful on some of the formulations. Most of them know, but there's definitely some out there that are a little bit hotter for sure. So be careful. Find one that's compatible for foliar applications, not one that's suitable for in-row applications with corn. Some of them can be a little hot, especially with some of the fungicides that already have a surfactant added to the fungicide.
So we're in some really, really cold weather, but we have snow cover in the north. Any concerns then?
I don't get too concerned. I mean, yes, it's been very cold, and I've had growers calling, hey, is the wheat okay? But remember, winter wheat is grown all the way into South Dakota, North Dakota, and even in some years without any snow cover at all in western North Dakota, most times it survives the winter. Now, they're obviously starting out by planting winter hardy varieties known to be tolerant to negative 30, 40 Fahrenheit temperatures. Here we don't often see, those kind of temperatures to need ultra winter hardy varieties, but especially with a little snow cover, and it doesn't take much snow cover, just an inch of snow cover makes a massive difference to insulating that plant and the crown of that plant. So as long as you got some snow cover, I wouldn't be concerned if it was minus 30, minus 40, but I think for the most part, 0 Fahrenheit or -5 is about as cold as I've seen across most of the wheat belt, excluding the northern North Dakota, South Dakota regions, okay?
I went to dig some plants for today, and no luck. We are froze up solid down here.
We at Merschman Seeds, Phil, have had a lot of interest in these ultra early wheat lines, and we've had more interest in double crop, being able to move those lines further to the north. Have you been seeing that the industry's trending in certain areas to very, very, very early wheat lines?
Yeah, definitely. There's always interest from farmers wanting very early wheat. The challenge is a little bit, as we discussed early on, those ultra early varieties break dormancy very early in the spring. And in a year when it's, 80 degrees in mid-March, and then it turns down to 0 or 20 degrees in the late week, last few days of March, first few days of April, freeze damage can be a massive problem in the early maturity varieties. But yes, it definitely gives you the opportunity to get the beans off early. Don't forget, most growers we work with in Kentucky, and you get too far north of Kentucky, growers just wonder what in the world we're doing. But there's a lot of growers in Kentucky that harvest wheat at 22 to 25% moisture. A lot of those guys are using a Shelbourne Reynolds strip ahead to get the wheat off at higher moisture, leave that residue standing so it's super easy to no-till soybeans in. But the big principle is getting that wheat off 5-7 days earlier than compared to harvesting it at 13 or 14%. So that holds true wherever we go. So for anybody that wants to double crop wheat, most of them guys are big corn producers. They don't think twice about drying 25 or 30% corn. But if you ever talk to them about harvesting wheat at 22 or 25% moisture, they think you're some kind of a nut. But just getting that wheat off early is huge in getting the beans in the ground and maybe catching another rain or two and helping the double crop bean yield. So it's very common for our growers to start at 22 or 25% moisture just to get those double crop beans in, again, 5 or 7 days earlier than waiting to 13, 14%, okay?
Are they using just air then to dry the wheat then in their bins?
Most guys would have a dryer, and they'd run that dryer at 180 or 200 Fahrenheit, something like that, sometimes 220, depending. As long as it's not seed that they're keeping, you couldn't do that at any temperature at all. But they would run it through a dryer. Again, a lot of growers that we work with harvest corn at 22, 25% moisture to get it off, to get the wheat in. So they're always just pushing that rotation hard. So getting the wheat off in an early fashion to get the beans in is pretty important to a lot of guys, okay?
We want to plant those early varieties a little bit later than normal for our dormancy to break. Is there a certain growth level that we have to have? Because as we plant later, obviously our season is shorter the further north we go. Is there a certain growth rate that you insist that we have to have in order for us to make it through winter kill?
I'm not sure about winter kill, but for maximum yields, we really like to see 2 or 3 tillers per plant in the fall. So when it turns dormant in normally December, this past December was very, very much warmer than normal. But normally when the wheat goes into dormancy in December, we really look for 2 to 3 tillers per plant in addition to the main stem. So I would encourage growers, even with a very early variety, plant it in a timely fashion, but not super early, but try and achieve 2 to 3 tillers and a main stem on each plant. And if you can get those plants spatially distributed, evenly across the field, a good seeder that's well set up, good displays if you know tilling, especially plenty of ballast. I mean, just set that drill up properly. You should be able to achieve 2 or 3 tillers per plant. That would be my goal, okay, for high yields.
Up north here, we don't have a lot of drills left. How do you feel about using the soybean planter and planting in 15-inch rows?
And how important is the variety to that?
Sure. So we've done a lot of work on that. Even when I was at Miles 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we were doing a lot of replicated trials, and there's a lot more recently, even from that I can share. But I think on average, 7.5-inch wheat compared to 15-inch wheat, the 15-inch wheat is somewhere between 10 and 15% lower yielding than the 7.5-inch wheat. And don't forget, the first wheat field I ever walked into when I first came to the US, it was a field of 7.5-inch wheat. And I looked down at it, wondered how in the world somebody could plant an entire field with every other row blocked up. And what I mean is, most every field of wheat in England, France, Germany, New Zealand, where the highest wheat yields come from, almost every field of wheat is planted on 4, 4.5, or 5-inch wheat. There'd be very little wheat planted in rows wider than 5. So 7.5-inch wheat, in my eyes, is still on the wide side of row spacing. So when guys start talking about 10-inch wheat or 15-inch wheat, there's definitely a yield lag associated with that. And the most current research, Dr. Dennis Pennington and Dr. Singh from Michigan State University did a study, I believe 2 years ago, and I think it was 2 sites over 2 years, 4 locations, replicated trials, and they were looking at 5, 7.5, 10, and 15-inch row spacing. Again, 4 site years, 2 locations, 2 years. And the 5-inch spacing was the highest yielding. The 7.5 was the next. The 10 was drastically lower, and the 15 was at the bottom. And there was some, I'd have to look at the data again, but there was 7.5 or 10 bushel per acre yield differences between some of them row spacing. So nobody that I work with raises 15-inch wheat. I've had some guys that tried it, and once they tried it, side by side in replicated strips, there was significant yield lag. I mean, I need to say, we've learned this many, many years ago, and we've reiterated and stated it, even recently. But if you want maximum wheat yields, you need close to 100% ground cover at the jointing stage. So at first joint, you want as close to 100% ground cover as possible. So that means a uniform field, no holes, no skips as a result of wheel tracks, ideally. But in addition to that, you want a uniform stand that's close to 100% ground cover at the jointing stage. 15-inch wheat doesn't provide you that. There's an app called Canopio. It's free on the App Store, Canopio. It originated from Oklahoma State University. It's a free app, and I'd encourage everybody to download that and hover above your wheat about 3 feet above the wheat. It estimates the percentage ground cover. And a lot of our fields are 85, 90, 95% ground cover on the high yielding fields. And that's our goal. If you hover over a 15-inch wheat field, it's 75 or 80%, even when it's planted early with plenty of seed. So I'm not a big fan of 15-inch wheat. If you don't have a drill, I understand it. You'd be better off spreading it evenly, preferably with an air spreader. I don't like the spinners because they don't deliver seed or fertilizer come to that very evenly, especially if it's windy on rolling ground. But if you can spread it evenly and then work it in shallow with a vertical tillage rig, they will be yield ahead compared to 15-inch wheat.
So what about the 15-inch planter and putting it into a diamond or splitting the rows with, using your GPS? tracking?
That would be good. It's very difficult to split 15-inch rows. Guys have tried that. If there's any kind of rolling ground at all, one set of planter openers tend to migrate right back into the pass of the last one. The planter draft sideways into the previous pass. So planted at a little angle, and it can't be a 1, 2, 3 degrees, because before you know it, you're planting back into the same passage you made the previous time. But if you can run at a 10, 15 degree angle the second time, just reduce the rate by half, plant it twice, then that gets pretty close to 7.5-inch wheat. Not exactly there, because you're compromising, you're disturbing some of the seed placement from the first pass, but that gets pretty close to 7.5-inch wheat, okay?
Phil, is there anything else that we are missing that you would like to talk about for high yielding, high management wheat?
Is anybody in the group familiar with yen?
I don't think I am.
No.
Let me give you a little background, and it'll make more sense when I talk about it. So yen is an intensive crop management program. By definition, it's a benchmarking program that originated from England about, I'm going to say 12, maybe 14 years ago. So it's a program out of England originally called YEN, Y-E-N. It's the Yield Enhancement Network. And there was some conversations, and yen was brought to Ontario about 3 or 4 years ago, I think. And I was able to get some growers signed up in yen as kind of an extension of the Michigan State University yen program. They allowed me 4 growers to work with in Kentucky. So we've been in the yen program 3 years now. So yen, all it is, it's a benchmarking program where we work closely with other agronomists within the same program and share and discuss results and what we're seeing. But as much as anything else, it's an intensive soil sampling program. It's an intensive tissue testing program. And we basically enter data within all of these fields that are in yen. And if I remember right, there's 150 in yen last year, 165 maybe. But when we gather all this information up, it all goes into a big computer software system. When you start looking at lots of data entered over multiple locations, over multiple years, you begin to separate out what's working and what's not working. And then they're adding climatic data, rainfall, temperatures, the amount of sunlight that we receive in different areas. They're able to pull that data. They're looking at row spacings. They're looking at different nitrogen timings. So it's basically a benchmarking program where we are able to benchmark one grower against another grower. And the highest yielding field, again, the one that broke the Kentucky State wheat yield last year with 143 point something, that was in yen. So for the past 3 or 4 years, yen has kind of been in a beta test format. There's a North American group, and I'm on that group of I guess, a leadership board for yen, and it's been limited from a point of view of being able to be offered to growers, but it's going to be offered to growers, publicly next year. So if anybody's interested in learning more about wheat, they need to contact the Michigan State University. Those are the facilitators of the yen right now. But there's a lot of good information that we're learning out of yen, and I'd encourage people to just look that up. There's different YouTube videos that talk about yen, but you're going to see a lot more about it, and it's going to be even more beneficial to growers as growers sign up and more growers enter the program within a geography. So the tighter the density of growers, the better we'll be able to compare and benchmark those growers with each other.
Do they have that similar program for corn and soybeans? Is it all put on? I think Iowa State did some preliminary presentations at the ICM conference last year on something that sounds very similar to that.
So there's not a North American yen. The yen in Europe has been expanded to canola, beans, peas, and some other crops. But at this time in North America, it's just yen. It's just, they call it cereal yen. I think there's some barley in it too, but I think it's just wheat and barley.
Gotcha. Very, very interesting. So what all does Needham Ag Technologies do other than consulting? And you can hit on that just a little bit, and how some of our viewers would be able to get a hold of you, whether it be from a consulting standpoint or I know that you sell some equipment as well.
So when we started Needham Ag in 2006, I've spent a huge amount of time over the past 34, 35 years working with growers, helping them set up their seeding equipment to do a better job. Now, if it's conventional tillage, most anybody can set up a piece of seeding equipment and it does an acceptable job if the ground's worked. But as more and more growers transition towards no-till, it becomes imperative, essential to have a good piece of seeding equipment that's set up properly to get seeds in the ground, especially if the ground's hard and you've got wheel tracks and there's clay soils that are dry. There's just so many things that we recognize that made a big difference. So making sure that the disc blades are up to spec and sharp, making sure all of the closing wheel pivots, make sure they got the right closing wheels on there. We learned early on that there's just a massive difference between getting a drill set up properly or an air seeder set up properly and the stands that we obtained when we did stand counts, and growers that just had a regular drill that they wasn't spending much time or money on maintenance on. So there's big advantages to getting equipment set up. And a lot of the manufacturers, they wasn't doing a great job at the time offering some of these aftermarket updates that growers needed. So we just took it upon ourselves to kind of develop some of these, different updates. We were doing research to back up the fact that this press wheel is better than the factory one. And it's comical that we came out with a new firming wheel a few years ago, and John Deere even copied it. The diameter's the same, the width's the same, they put the same type bearing in it. You can even disassemble it and put our wheel half on their wheel. It's so close. So we've done enough that, just for example, John Deere copied a wheel. It's just one wheel, but it's a principle that some of the products that we've developed over the years, John Deere even copied. So it's not rocket science. It's just little things that we found that make a difference.
Yep. So all of those different technologies or add-ons, aftermarket add-ons, can be found at Needham Ag Technologies if you Google that, I assume.
Yes, so we got a pretty good website at needhamag.com, and that'll explain a lot of the products that we offer for grain drills.
If anybody else has any questions for you, whether it be consulting or that, I assume contact for you is on there as well, right?
Yes, sir. There's a little box they can click and hit contact.
Perfect. So unless...
I'm going to give a compliment too on their website. It's so easy, and his son did a great job of describing how to fix a drill that even this office jockey was able to redo a 1690 John Deere soybean special last year. So even if you're not the most adept, your guys' website also comes with great YouTube instructionals on what to look for and how to fix stuff.
We spend quite a bit of time doing YouTube videos. I think there's 70 or 80 on there, and they're all practical, just simple, hey, this is what you need to look for type stuff. So, yeah, if anybody like to look, Needham Ag is a YouTube channel.
Perfect. Well, I can't let you go, Phil, without having to endure Joe's corny joke that he does at the end of every episode. So I'm going to tee it up for Joe to give us his corny joke for the week, and then we can let you run.
Phil, thank you for today. Very, very, very informative. And we do a corny joke at the end, basically like the original seed company that put corny jokes in their seed guides somewhere in the 20s and 30s to get people to turn the page, to see the next other seeds. Well, we thought we'd do the same thing with Cup of Joe to get people to stay to the end, but today I don't think anybody left for sure, I guarantee you. But anyhow, it's been very cold across the Midwest and Mid-South, so I thought I'd do some "it's so cold" jokes, It's so cold today in the office, Phil, that we had to salt the hallway, okay? It's so cold, the police tell a robber to freeze, and he does. It's so cold, the mailmen and mailwomen have to watch out not only for dogs, but polar bears. It's so cold last night, I had to open the refrigerator to heat the house. It's so cold that farmers that milk cows, they're getting ice cream instead of milk. It's so cold that the dogs had to put jumper cables on the rabbits just to get them to run. It's so cold, Jack Frost changed his name to Jack Froze. My heating bill came with a warning, sit down before opening. And the last one, this morning, when I turned the shower on, it started hailing. That's how cold it is. Anyhow, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Brett. We sincerely appreciate your information. No doubt help our customers make a little more money on their wheat. And we just love wheat like you, Phil. We really like wheat. It's a fun crop. And to manage it at the level that you're doing it makes it a very, very profitable crop. So thanks for coming on today. As always,
guys.
You bet. As always, those of you out there listening by podcast or watching on YouTube, please be safe, stay healthy. See you next week.